Works. Okay, so I think we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm McKenna from Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I'm so excited today to be joined by two of my favorite people. I've got John Connolly here and Stuart Neville. How are you guys?
I'm good. We were just commenting earlier when I saw Stuart, he looked like the Unabomber's musical cousin. But apart from that, I feel my cousin, my kitchen seems quite dull by comparison. But yeah, I'm really impressed by your gear, I have to say. Speaking of somebody who can't play an instrument, I'm amazed that anybody would have more than one.
Well, it is my vice, I have to be honest, but I regard them as investments, a really bad investment, but investments nonetheless.
I'm speaking of somebody who doesn't know anything about guitars. I mean, I assume this sounds like the dumbest question ever. They do different things, right? Are some bass and some rhythm, or are they the same thing? Or
every guitar has its own sort of voice and purpose and little kind of niche within my collection. I'm actually at the point where I've run out of sort of empty slots to fill with guitars now. I'm not saying I will never buy another guitar again, but I'm kind of at the limit of what I can physically contain within this room, but also the kind of gaps in the collection, and there's starting to be little overlaps. So I'm going to sell a few fairly soon just to things out. But it's like every man has his toys. What are you and your American muscle cars, for example?
I have one that's in pieces in a workshop because it needs to be torn apart and repainted. But my vice is books. I mean, I have these. Exactly the same argument with my other half. There are rules. I'm not allowed to double up bookshelves, okay, because that way lies madness. But inevitably you buy more books than you read, and some of them you're holding on to read later, and some are they're signed or I like them, and but now I'm running out of places to put them, and my son is afraid to use our spare bathroom downstairs because the big bookshelf is right above it, and he doesn't think that will be a dignified way to go when it collapses and comes straight down on top of him. So books they are kind of my vice, and recently about a year or so ago, I replaced my record player and I put a record player in my office. And now actually buying records I had on CD, on vinyl, and especially box sets and, stuff with inserts and things, the physical object, that's become a bit of a vice too, that I'm going to have to get control of.
But that's, I think, one of the great things for the book industry, though, is that despite all predictions, I remember some people confidently predicting that the ebook will destroy the print book by 2-3 years ago. But I think the physical object is a part of the experience of enjoying the media. So, I mean, for me, I don't get on with ebooks at all whatsoever. I like audiobooks a lot, but if I'm going to read with my eyes, I suppose my ears, I want the physical object in my hands, and I want it on my shelf as well.
Yeah, you're right. Those of us who like books like being surrounded by books, and it's hard to surround yourself with an ebook. And it has its purpose. But I'm a bit like you. I'm a bit old-fashioned like that. But I think I can remember there were a couple of writers who became real proselytizers, shills for ebooks. And what annoyed me about it was that they were. I don't care how you read a book as long as you read a book and pay for it. But it was almost the joy they were taking in bookstores closing, that they felt that, I remember one of them comparing it to dinosaurs, your pet Stegosaurus died was the crack he made. What a shame. And yet, to see a writers rejoicing over the death of bookstores, to see rejoicing over the closure of bricks and mortar bookstores was really depressing. But also, there were two things that struck me about it. The first was that it was a really first world attitude. Because actually, when I was the Dirty South set down in Arkansas, and when I was down there, they still had video stores because not everybody could afford good internet. Not everybody could afford to stream. And in Maine, I have friends who don't have internet access in their homes because they're barely making the cut as it is. When they want to use the internet, they go to a Starbucks. So for them, having access to physical books, not just a matter of the fact that they like books being around them, it's actually the only option for them. And it was really depressing. It really angered me to see those writers essentially, metaphorically trampling on what they thought was the rubble of bookstores. And I feel really vindicated, as you do, that they've persisted, that stores like Murder by the Book have continued to thrive. They underestimated readers. And I think they underestimated the generosity and loyalty of readers, and also the love of readers, as you say, for the physical book.
And I mean, there is a place, there is a market, and there is its own unique ecosystem of books that cost 99 cents or 99 pence, you know.
Yeah.
And I know plenty of authors who work in that field and are really smart business-wise and so on, but there seemed to be a framing back then. I mean, this is an old controversy we're getting into, I guess, but there seemed to be a framing back then of it being a them and us.
Yeah, absolutely. Rather than a coexistence, that they could coexist. And,
yeah, which is the way it shook out eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's wonderful.
And that ecosystem is very much a self-contained thing. It doesn't seem to really encroach onto the print book market and vice versa. They're kind of their own spheres. And you, like me, are very, very glad that Murder by the Book and No Alibis in Belfast and Poison Pen and all those great stores are still there for us, because I mean, it's God, I wouldn't get out of the house otherwise.
Well, that's what I was thinking, yeah, and it would be very difficult to meet readers and booksellers. And I mean, that's while this is a lovely thing to do. I was just saying to McKenna before we came on, it was about this time last year that you know, I was in that area of the world, and it was really lovely to see people, you know. And as writers, we spend so much time sitting alone staring at screens. I'm not sure that I want that to be my process and my experience when a book comes out. Part of it is to go out into the world with a book and to meet people, and not just to talk about your own book, but to talk, as we're doing, about books in general with people who love books and who love being part of that community. Because, you know, I will occasionally, politically, sometimes you'll differ with people, and especially in the current climate, but you're united by the fact that you love books. When you go into a bookstore, you know that everybody there has come because they love books. They love reading. They may not be coming because they know you terribly well. They might just have seen your name on the wall and thought, well, I'm doing nothing. You know, I have finished paring my corns. I may as well go to see that bloke. Yet at the same time, there is that sense that you're united by this love of these objects and the pleasure that they give. And so you have this common ground. When you may differ about other things, you will come together over the fact that you love books.
And I think when you know somebody that's into books, that guarantees at least a certain level of intelligence and human empathy.
Yeah, empathy is a big one. I do absolutely agree with you.
So I think it's hard to, I mean, there will be readers, I'm sure, out there who I would have very different views of the world from, for all sorts of reasons, but you would have that, as you said, common thread, at least, where you can enjoy being in somebody else's head for 300, 400, 500 pages, however much, and getting that, being able to use your brain in the way that only reading does and the reading books does, because it's that engagement of the imagination, but also the heart as well, which comes from reading books. And you know, so book people, in my experience, generally been pretty decent.
Yeah, I think you're right. That word compassion that you used, I know that there was a survey conducted of children who read, and children who read fiction were much more empathetic or empathic than those who didn't. That was an emotional capacity that they developed through reading. And you know, it's, if you can put your book into your kids' hands, if you can encourage them to read, that you're probably creating happier adults down the line. At the very least, you're creating adults who will never be bored, as long as they have a book, obviously. I'm suddenly conscious of the fact that McKenna did suggest that we talk amongst ourselves. Hey, McKenna, you're here. How are you doing? What do you do?
I was going to introduce you to, but just let you talk books and bookstores all day. I totally agree with you. I think that reading allows you to be more empathetic because you're reading about other people's experiences and you're seeing the world through their eyes. So I'm good listening, but I do want to give both of you a chance to talk about your new books today because that's why we're here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the official introductions, and we're going to go down that path, and then whatever tangent you want to take us on once I get these introductions done, we'll go with. So John Connolly is the author of the Charlie Parker series of thrillers, the supernatural collection Nocturnes, the Samuel Johnson Trilogy for younger readers, and with Jennifer Ridyard, the Chronicles of the Invaders series. He lives in Dublin, Ireland, and he's with us today to talk about Dirty South, which is the 18th Charlie Parker novel, but also a prequel. So I don't need to say hi. We've already said hello. I will mention that we have signed postcards for anyone who orders Dirty South, as well as this While They Last, this super cool tote bag, Charlie Parker Investigations and Private Investigations, Parker Private Investigations. There we go. And then with a cool graphic on the back. So anyone who wants to order Dirty South from us gets the signed postcard and the tote bag. And then moving on to Stuart Neville, he has been called the King of Belfast Noir by The Guardian. He's the author of 9 novels, for which he has won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and been shortlisted for the Edgar, Macavity, Dilys, Barry, and Anthony Awards, as well as the CWA Steel Dagger. He lives near Belfast. He is with us today to talk about his latest collection, The Traveler and Other Stories, for which John actually wrote the foreword. And for those of you who don't know what this collection is about, it actually is a collection of short stories, but it also includes a novella, The Traveler, which ties into one of my all-time favorite books, Ghosts of Belfast. So that is that. If you have questions, I'm going to be monitoring. I'm not being rude looking at my phone. I'm going to be monitoring the chat on YouTube for any questions for either or both gentlemen. But let's get started with just a quick elevator pitch or brief description of your new books. So Stuart, let's start with you.
I'm not sure I can do better than you did, McKenna, to be honest. It's a gathering of more than a decade's worth of stories, along with this novella, as you mentioned, called The Traveler. And yeah, The Traveler itself is a kind of a tying up of loose ends. And I constantly been asked questions over the years of what happened to Jack Lennon afterwards and what happened to The Traveler and other characters. And the opportunity of writing the collection gave me an excuse to write the novella, or publishing the collection gave me an excuse to write the novella as well. And which I greatly enjoyed, and it sort of ticks off a lot of boxes for me and gave me a chance to revisit those characters. So it's nice that I was able to frame it with all these other stories that I had kind of gathering dust that I wanted to sort of frame them in some way and get them out there for people to read, and also just kind of reintroduce myself, because it's been a while since I published anything under my own name. So it was a nice way of just saying, hey, I'm still here. You know.
Great. How about you, John?
The Dirty South, as you said, is a kind of prequel. It is set shortly before the events of my first novel, Every Dead Thing. And I was interested in exploring a younger Parker. Parker, by the most recent books, is almost a kind of Christ figure with added violence, but a Christ figure nonetheless, who's just kind of incapable of turning away from the pain of others. This massively compassionate man. And in this book, he isn't. He is just this creature driven by grief and rage. And he's drawn to a small town in Arkansas simply because he's looking for cases that have echoes of the deaths of his own wife and child. And when it turns out that this case he's looking into has nothing to do with it, he just wants to leave. He feels no moral obligation to intervene or to help in any way. And actually, he leaves town when he has the opportunity to go. He goes. And I suppose the book is a way of examining the dawning of a conscience, where what transforms him, what makes him come back, and the consequences when he does come back.
Fantastic.
And I did write the introduction to Stuart's book, and the check that was promised hasn't arrived. Now, I'm sure that there's a problem with the post somewhere, but it was promised quite a long time ago, and I only lived down the road. He could almost have delivered it by himself.
Did you take a guitar?
Sorry? Yeah, I couldn't play them. I don't know what I'd do with it. I'd use it to swat flies in summer, probably. I couldn't think of anything else to do with it. But I will say, because Stuart and I have known each other for a very long time, I was thinking when I wrote the introduction that I was remembering when I met him, and it was at a festival in Dunleary, in many years ago, and it was a really awkward fest, not because of Stuart, because Stuart's a perfectly nice man most of the time, but it was awkward because I'd done a panel which seemed like a really good. I was asked to chair a panel, and so I was asking writers to read. It was about sex and violence in books, and I thought it would be a really good idea to get writers to read either a piece of violence or a piece of sex from their own work, because it's all very well writing it, but reading it makes you look at it in a completely different way. And of course, all the people on the panel chose a piece of violence to read, because it's actually obviously much easier to read a piece of violence. And I thought, well, it's not much point having a panel about sex and violence if we only talk about violence. And I haven't written very many sex scenes, but there was one in my first book. And so I decided that I would read the sex scene from Every Dead Thing. And I looked down into the audience, and a Freudian nightmare unfolded because my mother was there. My mother hadn't told me that she was going to this event. And so I started reading this sex scene with my mother staring up at me. And frankly, that's the kind of thing that, that buys a psychiatrist a car eventually, just that one incident. So it cast a kind of pall over the rest of the day. But I remember Stuart coming up to me, and I had no idea I really didn't know who he was. And he said, I've written a novel and it's about to be published. And I thought, great, can you go away now? Because that's good on you. But, and he asked, would I read it? And your heart does sink a little bit. And I'm sure Stuart has had that experience since then. When someone gives you a book, you think, oh God, really? But then it was The Ghost of Belfast. And I remember reading it on a plane, flying to New Jersey, to go and research one of my own books, and I'm just being blown away by it. I thought it was the most extraordinary novel, and certainly the first great post-Troubles novel. I mean, it was an extraordinary piece of work. And reading The Traveller and other stories, what I loved about that book, I suppose, was that in a weird way, it made me feel slightly less alone in what I was doing, because I had this fascination with the supernatural, and I thought there's something very Irish about it. I think that reluctance to embrace completely the rationalist crime novel or mystery novel. And Stuart was doing something similar. He was setting it north of the border, and he was setting it against a backdrop of terrorism, but he was very comfortable with the same idioms with which I was comfortable. And when I read The Traveller and other stories, part of it is a series of supernatural stories, and I loved it. What's lovely about that story is to see somebody continuing a tradition that's so important in Irish literature. For a long time, fantasy and the supernatural, that was our genre fiction. In the 19th century, into the early 20th century, that was what we did. And it kind of fell by the wayside a little bit. And so it's just great to see somebody as talented as Stuart taking up that baton and writing those stories. I think it's a really wonderful volume of short stories. I just want to say that because not just because the check will eventually arrive, and actually now you'll feel guilty enough to add something extra onto it, but because sometimes people shy away from short stories a little bit, where it's an odd thing. They simply don't sell quite in the same quantities as novels do, and yet there's a different pleasure to them. It requires reading in a slightly different way, but the pleasure they offer is different from a novel, and so I think a collection like that also has a novella in it is a lovely entry point to that kind of reading.
First of all, thank you very much for such kind words. Appreciate that. To go back to John's anecdote about reading the sex scene in front of his mother, I can't let this go past.
Please, do we have to?
All I'll say, I have never seen anybody go so red in my life. I'm talking like sort of tomato red. It was quite astonishing. You could feel the heat radiating.
It was horrible.
So it's
amazing that I ever managed to have sex again with anybody after that. That it was just, that it didn't cast some kind of huge. I didn't just join a monastery and go, listen, I'm just going to put all that by the way. So let's just forget that ever happened. Can I just do the gardening? Because, I never want to think about this again. And do you put saltpeter in the food? Because I think that would be really helpful,
But that evening, it was this mini crime festival in Dunleary, which is a sort of a port town just outside Dublin, which I travelled down to, and I'd never been to any kind of a book festival before in my life. And I was terrified going, I have to be honest. I didn't know anybody within the crime fiction scene at this point, apart from a couple of sort of introductions I made online to maybe Declan Burke and Jared Brennan, people like that. But I arrived at this festival, and the only experience I'd had of anything like this before was at film festivals, which I'd attended some years before when I was trying to break into writing music for film. And they were horrible places. They were terrible places full of terrible people. And I remember being at one of those things in Galway, and as a composer handing somebody my business card and them trying to tear it up in my face. And they couldn't because I'd laminated it, which was good. So I went to this book festival kind of thinking, all right, this is going to be a similarly kind of closed shop. And I said hello to a couple of people through the day. I remember Arlene Hunt and Brian McGilloway saying hello to, but and then seeing John at the back of the room and kind of girding myself and walking over to Mr. Connolly, sir, would you mind reading it? And John doing a very good job of hiding it.
I might have liked you more,
But John sort of was as well as being kind enough to agree to read the book, also kind of basically sick him on for a pint as well. So it kind of that weekend served as my introduction into the crime fiction community, largely through John, and ever then discovering what a welcoming community it was. And it was the first of many kindnesses John has done for me over the years. I'm not going to list them all off, but they include things like moving his own event date to suit me, that kind of thing in Belfast, and just all sorts of things that John had no sort of personal gain from doing, but just did because he's a nice bloke. So thank you, John.
That's very kind of you. It's a mutual admiration society. But when I started, people did the same thing for me. That I remember people being very kind to me, especially in Britain when I went over, because when Stuart and I met, it was still kind of a nascent Irish crime scene in a way, that there were writers I hadn't written very many books, and there were writers producing really just like Stuart producing their first book. And so I think people were very conscious that we had to, it was like, when you see shoots coming up out of the earth, you have to try and take care of them and make sure that they continue, because it was something that for a long time hadn't really been part of the Irish literary tradition at all. It had been very much neglected. And so it was, it's almost impossible now looking back to think what things were like in maybe 2000 and 2001 in the Irish crime scene. There really wasn't much of an Irish.
You and Ken Bruin, really, wasn't it?
It was Ken, yeah. There was probably Ken. There were a couple of
in the north,
Eugene McEldowney and people who had written books, but that hadn't really managed to capture the imagination of Irish readers to begin with, who weren't used to seeing their country looked at through the medium of crime fiction. We weren't conditioned to do that. You made an opposite choice to it. I did. I know some Northern Irish writers like Steve Kavanagh made the same choice of not actually setting your work in Ireland. I know for me, when I was starting to write, I wrote 2 novels that were really bad and will never be published. But one was set in Florida, where I've still never ever been. The other was set in Manchester, at least I lived there for a couple of years. But I had a real resistance to writing about Northern Ireland. And oddly enough, the first book I wrote that actually was set in Northern Ireland was the one that got a publishing deal. But you basically gave Ireland a swerve as a setting. You wanted to sort of step aside from that. You could maybe legitimately argue that I chickened out, I decided that wasn't going to be my fight. I just had such an antipathy towards a very limited view of what it meant to be an Irish writer. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sure that those attempts to import the conventions of the American crime novel into Ireland, because largely people were importing American private eye novel conventions rather than British crime fiction, because I think Britain was too close and the history was too complicated. So a lot of us looked to America as we had to as a mode of escape all through our life. People had physically gone to America for generations. Why wouldn't writers look there for a kind of imaginative escape as well? And that was the view I took. And it took me a long time to realize that actually, Americans write perfectly good crime fiction of their own. They really need some bloke coming on, like Charlie McCarthy and Charlie McCarthy doing kind of some imitation of it. And also that anything that made me distinctive was my Irishness, was that fascination that we've spoken about already with the supernatural, with the metaphysical, that comfort with fairy tales and folk tales, which aren't part of that American crime tradition. And they were the things that were distinctive, but I still didn't want to use them to write about Ireland. And now I suppose the time has gone too far. I'm so committed to what I'm doing, I think. But I'm interested when you said Northern Ireland, because one of the things I admired about what you did was that there was a certain antipathy probably in Britain towards mainland Britain, that's probably like mainland England, let's call it England, towards books set in Northern Ireland, because I think there was it had such negative connotations. I mean, it was associated with, I guess, poverty and bigotry, but also with violence and the deaths of obviously young people and British soldiers who had been sent over there, but also people, obviously the citizenry who were living there. was there a reaction against that? I mean, were there obstacles that you had to overcome?
Well, the first obstacle was my own personal aversion to it, and I did, like, the one place I vowed I wasn't going to write about was Northern Ireland, and the one subject I wasn't going to write about was the Troubles. And then along comes Ghost of Belfast, which kind of trampled all over that aversion. But I mean, with the title, even the title in itself was actually, I remember Colin Bateman mentioning to me long before Ghost of Belfast came out. First time I met him, said they're not going to let you keep that title. They're going to make you change that title, and he was right. You know,
in England, in the UK publishers,
the UK publishers, and he was right. Within a few months off, or when they were starting to gear up to publicize the book, there was a quiet word had, and maybe think about, when we say think about, just do it. Change the title for this one. And it was published as the 12 in the UK, and it is because it becomes difficult. As Colin said to me, you will not sell a book with Belfast on the cover. The retailers, the big box retailers, aren't going to be comfortable with it. And that was true. And the thing is, it was nowhere more true than in Belfast itself, which is the real kicker, because there was, and I understand it, because I have that feeling myself. My own internal feeling was I didn't want to write about it. And I know myself, if I was browsing through TV listings and there was a documentary about Belfast, I'd go, oh God. You know, and there was a sense of just being too close and too raw and so on. I do think that has been broken down in the years since then, because we're talking 12 years ago in the run up. Ghost Belfast came out in 2009, but signed the deal in 2008, so you're talking 12 years now. On from then, and I think a lot of that is broken down simply because of distance of time. Mm-hmm. The Troubles, and also Belfast's regeneration over the last 20 years, and then we see things like The Fall, the TV series being set in Belfast, and people watching it, enjoying it, and understanding there can be crimes other than that don't involve bombs under cars and so on in Belfast. And it used to be, when I did like library events and so on here, people would say to me, like, I don't really like to read about Northern Ireland, but your book was okay. But then it started changing to, I really liked that I knew that street you were talking about. And there was a shift here, as well as, I think, a softening in England. Now, it's still there. It's still a problem. And, I had my own experiment with writing sort of American set thrillers. Not entirely successfully, to be honest with you, but that the experience of doing that has kind of made me realize, actually, I want to set books here. And like the novel I have coming out next, it'll be out this time next year in the States, which we still don't have a title for. It's a third of that book is written in Northern Irish vernacular, in kind of Ulster Scots dialect. And it's kind of, I think, remember you saying to me, or saying on a panel, or as you want to do, because you're very wise, that every book is a reaction to the last one.
I think I got some sarcasm on me there, because it kind of burns. There's a little mark.
I remember you saying every book is a reaction to the last. And I think that's a very true thing. And the book that's coming out next, and to an extent, this story collection as well, is a reaction to the two Hill and Beck books that I wrote. Is kind of a reset and I'm not trying to be as overtly commercial, and so I'm kind of thinking, right, I've done that, now I'm doing this. And I mean, I think I've been reading The Dirty South, and it feels also, because your books had, I think, moved more over the last few years, have moved more steadily into the Gothic and the supernatural, and this book feels like very much a step away from that.
Yeah,
is that
very,
fair to say?
very consciously so. I think I'd written a 6-novel sequence that began with The Wolf in Winter and ended with A Book of Bones that kind of formed a circle. And I thought A Book of Bones had probably taken the supernatural stuff as far as I could go for the moment. And so the idea of putting all of that stuff aside and actually challenging myself a little bit, because I know, as writers, we learn that certain things work. Certain things almost work as the reader reacts to them, and that if you put this in a book, you'll get a certain response to them. And so the idea of putting aside one of the things I knew worked, one of the things I was comfortable with, and seeing what I could do without it, like throwing your crutch away or something to see if you stumble, was interesting to me. What would, I suppose the question was, what would a more conventional crime novel look like if I wrote it? What would happen to me? What would the style be like? And in a sense, writing the Dirty Side was quite liberating in a way. Not having to worry about the character's history, not having to worry about that larger, those metaphysics, I suppose, that idea of layers, of the honeycomb world, of what lies beyond, and actually restricting it. A Book of Bones, had short stories embedded to it. It moved through different periods of history. And then the Dirty Side restricts itself to one small county, and in fact, for the most part, one small town, which is a return very much to the very traditional type of crime novel, where if you think of Agatha Christie, it's like somebody puts a glass jar over the town or over the boat or over the train or whatever it might be, and nobody can get out. And part of the tension from the book arises from that sense of claustrophobia, that sense of not being able to escape what's happening. I think The Ghost of Belfast works in a similar way. There is that sense of a character being trapped in this environment, and in The Ghost of Belfast, also being trapped by history in a way, being trapped by your own past. And what do you do to escape that? What are you going to have to sacrifice to do that? But then, then having written that book, then the next book is, and oddly enough, I wrote a globe-trotting thriller because I quite liked those, and I thought, I'll have a go at one of those. And of course, next thing you know, nobody can go anywhere. And so the book I've written that's coming out next year looks a bit like a fairy tale now, like a piece of, profound, imaginative work. And yet I resisted the urge I didn't want to take the book back and say, I'm going to start sticking in COVID references to it, because the books chronologically don't follow year on year. I mean, that 6-novel sequence takes place over the space of about 18 months in the world of the books. But also I thought, actually, and it's an interesting question that we're going to have to ask. Are readers going to want every book they read over the next 6 months to have references to hand sanitizer and masks?
Well, to answer that one, I've done a sort of a revision or rewrite of the novel that's coming out next year, and I asked my UK editor, should I add in some reference? And before I even finished the sentence, she goes, no. She was very, very firm. Just to leave that alone. And part of the problem is, I guess, for a publisher now, it's kind of a moving target.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we don't know where we're going to be a year from now. Really, we could still be in the same situation we are now. And as slow as the publishing industry is, that 1 year, 2 year kind of cycle, how can you try and aim a shot at what's 12 months from now? We don't know what's happening a week or a month from now, And
also, isn't part of the pleasure of fiction escapism? It's to escape. I think it's a very underrated pleasure that we're sometimes reluctant to talk about. We talk about escapism like it's a bad thing, but actually, when you're in a situation like this, you look to escapism, you look to nostalgia, you look to things that actually bring you back to a more comforting time in a way. And so, I felt that actually I didn't have a problem publishing a book that relied upon elements of free movement that we just don't have at the moment, because I think actually for the reader there might be a certain pleasure and comfort in reading that kind of book. But as you say, yes, it's very difficult to decide what we're going. Sorry, I keep looking aside because I have a very old dog who's wandering around the kitchen, and we occasionally have accidents, and we're trying to avoid any future accidents. So I thought, and I've been down the line, I'll see as I'm working on things what might happen. But for the moment, I think I'm happy enough leaving things as they are.
Well, the 2 points. I mean, first of all, I firmly believe fiction. Most people regard fiction as a window rather than a mirror, which to a large extent explains my aversion to writing about Northern Ireland and the Troubles. But also, I think this pandemic is going to be like a war, in that the best fiction about those kind of great global crises doesn't tend to come along until years after. And in that, we're looking at movies, we didn't see all that great cinema about Vietnam until the late 70s into the 80s. And I think we only see a book like Milkman by Anna Burns about the Troubles so many years after the Troubles have theoretically concluded. And with the pandemic, it's going to be 5-10 years from now, after it's, or from now, whenever it's over, that people, I think, are going to actually start addressing it in fiction. And I'd also say it's more than likely it's the speculative fiction writers who will tackle it first in more kind of allegorical ways. And it'll happen by metaphor, first of all. In the way that Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings about
World War I
fascism in Europe and so on. I think you see the sci-fi writers, the fantasy writers will be addressing this before any of the rest of us, and maybe 10 years from now, we'll start seeing.
There's an argument other than, I should say, reflecting the world. Whether those references are going to add any profundity to what we do, they're probably not. They're just going to be a form of kind of window dressing. And you're right. I think anything that might represent profound lessons from what we're going through will probably take a little bit of time to emerge. Certainly in fiction. But I think the problem for crime writers is that we, unlike a lot of writers, we tend to produce a book every year. And we tend to not often, in that sense, to some degree, you're maybe more aware of current events and those little changes in the way the public are dealing with what's going on around them than somebody who produces a book every 10 years where they have the ability to take the long view that we are, to some degree. I think one of the problems we had with Irish crime fiction in the beginning was that there were some writers who felt that it had to be a reflection of Irish society. And so we had a lot of books about the Celtic tiger economy and the collapse of it, and corrupt politicians and builders. And actually, while I think Irish readers were maybe interested in reading about that in newspapers, they didn't particularly want to see fiction examining it. They didn't feel that was its role, and there was no great particular pleasure for them in doing that. And as you say, maybe now we're seeing interesting fiction emerge with an awareness of that time. But I remember, I think it was Fintan O'Toole, who's a very astute and intelligent commentator, commenting that actually one of the interesting things about crime fiction was that it was tackling these issues. And by implication, he was suggesting that actually it was the only interesting thing about it, that it had that ability to do it. And I thought that was the least interesting thing about it, that people were now writing about builders and gangland and, you know, guys getting into drug dealing because they couldn't support the payment of their loans or whatever it might be. It just seemed to be that actually crime fiction have a much larger role and is often much more interesting when it's looking at the bigger picture rather than getting too allied to specifics, too allied to particular periods of time, because it dates it terribly.
Yeah.
You know, as you say, while we are going to have books down the line that will look at the coronavirus, and I hope in a really interesting way, if we're fortunate enough a couple of years down the line, or two, and I hope we will be, to have a vaccine and to have moved on a little bit, books that are filled with references to masks and hand sanitizer and, you know, not being able to travel more than 5 miles from your home to take a walk with your dog or whatever it will be, they'll come to seem hugely dated and also perhaps slightly irritating. You know, we'll think, actually, yeah, that's a period that I would rather actually forget about, because by and large, 2020 was a pox year for everybody. And the sooner we write it off the calendar and get on to 21, the better it will be for everybody. So it's a difficult one for crime writers, because, like I said, we do tend to publish more often, and we do tend to have that awareness of what's going on around us, because it does inform what we do to a degree.
McKenna, are you all right there?
I'm great. We just had a comment on YouTube that says, basically, thanks, McKenna. Clearly, you've got an easy job today. Thank you for letting them speak. I will pat myself on the back, because I set this up. And when I saw that John Connolly had the foreword to Stuart Neville's new book coming out months ago, I beat down every door to try to make this event happen, because I knew this is what would happen. You two would just have a fascinating conversation that everyone wants to listen to. So
you get big money, because you make those kind of connections.
I will also say that this, ironically, is the event that I'm perhaps most prepared for, knowing both the authors and their books so well. And I haven't needed anything. I have questions about your fascination with the supernatural and the fact that this one is not supernatural, John. I have questions about setting books in America and why. I have questions, basically everything you've already talked about, unprompted. So Here's the only thing I'm going to say. I do have a couple questions from the comments that I'm going to get to. We have a very quick one. Someone wants to know what John is drinking.
Oh, cheap red wine.
I was going to just type red wine, but yeah.
Expensive red wine. I mean, this is the stuff we used to make gravy. And it's actually really nice. It costs about $5 a bottle. There are drunks under bridges who are drinking a higher class, but it's actually for a £5 bottle of wine, it's really rather nice. So I can recommend it highly. Radio Boca, fantastic stuff.
Excellent. So what I would like to just, this is my general prompt. I want to talk about writing process. I want to know what your days look like when you're writing. I want to know how, if you have writer's block, you get past it. And I want to know what techniques you use to keep the pacing in your books going. Essentially, are you plotters, pantsers? How does that work? So I'm going to press play on you guys for writing process, go to town, and then in a little bit, I'll come back on with a couple crowd questions.
Stuart, you want to grab that bull by the horns first?
Only to say that I kind of don't have one. And you would think I would after a dozen years in the business doing this, but I do admire those writers who can do that book a year. And I've kind of more or less done a book a year, but it's not been quite working out that way. But I know writers like Rankin and Val, they'll have this set of months in the year where they write, and this set of months where they edit, and this set of months when they promote. And I've never been able to sort of structure my time in such a way to do that. I mean, there's maybe not been helped by the fact of young kids and stuff, and at least that's an excuse anyway. And certainly this year, when the kids were off school for 6 months, it was not conducive to writing, I have to say. But one of the things I struggle with very often is figuring out what I've actually got when I've got an idea of something I want to write about. It very often comes as kind of either still image or a certain scene or a situation or sort of a flash of something. And the process of writing is kind of extrapolating from that point. But sometimes the difficult thing is figuring out the difference between an idea and a story, because they're two very, very, very different things. There's been times when I've had an idea where I thought, oh, God, that's brilliant. That's going to sell. This is the next Da Vinci Code. This is fantastic. And then you sit down to write it and you realize it's actually just an idea. It's a setup. Oh, my dog has just let himself into the room. Sweeney, come on see everybody.
Oh, bless.
How are you, Sweeney? Yeah. Can I kick you out now? Away you go. Go on. Oh no, he wants to go in under he sleeps under my desk sometimes. He's looking in there. Yeah, but you sit down and you actually try to write the thing and you realize it might have been a brilliant idea, but it wasn't a story. It wasn't 80, 90, 100,000 words worth of sort of subplots and characters and all the rest of the stuff that's come along with it. So I very often struggle with that idea of figuring out what I've got. I mean, there's a story in this collection called Echo, which came about. You were mentioned the idea of writer's block, and I was struggling for about a year to write anything. I had any number of ideas, but every time I tried to sit down and write, I would just run out of steam, or I couldn't find the direction. It wasn't working. But one of those ideas was, and I woke up in the middle of the night and with this idea of a 12-year-old boy who's being raised as the reincarnation of his own dead sister. And I actually got up out of bed and came to my office and switched on the computer and started writing. And very quickly, over a few weeks, I turned out at about 15,000 words of a story, but I couldn't figure out, is this a short story? Is this a novel? Is it a novella? What is this? And I struggled. I never finished it. And it just sort of languished then on the hard drive. But I knew there was something there. I liked the setup, but I couldn't figure out how to actually turn it into something. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago, a Belfast writer called Lucy Caldwell, a great literary writer and playwright, was putting together an anthology of Irish short fiction. And I couldn't come up with anything for her. I just had no story to give her. But eventually, like 2 days before the deadline, I remember this story called Echo. That at 15,000 words was going to be far too long. So I dug it out and actually over a couple of days I paired off to about 6,000 words. And I realized all along it was a short story. And that's what it should have been all this time. Which in terms of process is kind of, it's always a stumbling block for me at the very start, is just figuring out, is this a novel? Is it what is this? Once I figured that out, I don't know if you do anything like this, John, but I have notebooks. I have a bit of a superstition about moleskin notebooks, and I will basically constantly make notes as I go. But that's far as it gets as a process, as any kind of methodology, it's simply sitting down, churning out the words when I can, scribbling in one of these, and doing it until something comes together, until something works, and then just trying to keep my head down and keep going. I don't have that sort of getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and writing from 5 till 8 like some authors do, or, you know, I don't have that daily routine like a lot of writers do. I don't seem to do well with that kind of restriction. Yeah,
I'm slightly different. Maybe it's partly the journalism background. I like having targets, and I'm boring you. Come back. It could be really interesting, honest. I was afraid to do that with the dog. I thought people were going to shout at me, and I'm just hoping.
Oh no, my is one of my children will then appear in this door.
No, that's just an excuse. Yeah. You had your chance to talk. You just wanted to listen to me. You've already heard of this before. Yeah, I'm not. I set myself targets every day. I'm very goal oriented in that way. Even when I go to the gym, like one of my luxuries is that I do have a trainer, and because otherwise I'm just going to be living in my old filth, wearing Spanx, surrounded by half-eaten potato chips, and he does have to tell me you have to do 15. There's no point saying keep going until you stop or until you get tired. No, I need to know what I'm going to do. But I never start with. I only ever have a very vague idea of what I'm doing when I sit down, and I'll know the opening of whatever I'm doing. And I do tend to be pretty clear on whether it's a short story or whether it's. And if it's something with Parker, it's a novel. I kind of realize that now. There's going to be that kind of space. And then I write very slowly every day. And gradually the novel begins to emerge. And I don't go back. I don't look at anything I've written. Once I've written something, I leave it there and I move on to the next chapter. I will change. I will let names fall by the wayside. I'm working on something at the moment where there is a character who's dead by the end of it, but there's no reason why he's dead at the moment. I know what's happened to him, just haven't got around to writing it. I just wanted to get a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then I spend a lot of time rewriting, and I love the process of rewriting. I hate the first draft. I hate it. It's really difficult and time consuming because I'm not a planner. And if I planned it out, it would be much easier. But I wouldn't want to write the book. If I had it laid out, I would have no interest in writing it. Part of the pleasure is discovering the book. And because I hope what I do is quite character driven, and the way that what you do is, I think if you're doing very plot driven work, you probably need to map it out. You just have to. It's going to be very difficult. If you're doing character driven work, you kind of discover the characters in the process of writing. You don't sit down at the beginning and say, he likes hats, he has 2 dogs, he wears size 6 shoes, he was married once and divorced. That's not writing a character. That's kind of technical work. You have to discover the characters you go on. But the 2 things I do know is that the moment I begin writing something, I commit to finishing it. I have nothing abandoned at all from the 20 years that I've worked. There are no half-finished stories. Even if it's very difficult, I will keep going until the end of it. And that's partly my own obsessive compulsive nature, which, and it may well be because when I was a kid, I had profound OCD. I really did. And I wonder sometimes if it's a little aspect of that feeds into my work, that once I begin something, I'm actually not capable of leaving it unfinished. It would actually bother me. And so I keep going towards the end. And you did ask about writer's block, McKenna. What I found, I don't think there is any one thing that's writer's block. It just manifests itself in so many different ways for so many different writers. And, if you're having a bad day, yeah, you can go for a walk with the dog, or you go and watch football. I mean, I will still meet the target that I've set myself, but it may be that that's not a very productive day's work. But what I will often do is what I found is that if I take a day off work, it takes me another day or so to get back into it. That it's a muscle that very quickly loses its memory. And so if I'm having trouble with a book, and I have had trouble with novels, sometimes I'll write a piece of nonfiction. I will go and write something different, but I will keep writing. I think counterintuitively, the way to deal with writer's block is to keep writing, but is maybe to take a side turning and write something that isn't different. So you're working the muscle that is different. You're working the muscle, but you're not concentrating on this thing that is blocking you. But you're still finding a way to progress with what you're doing. I remember I was having trouble with a book, and I ended up writing, because I used to do in the good old days when it was easy to put CDs into books, I would do these compilations of music that mattered to me or that had references in the books. And I remember sitting down and I began writing an essay on some of the songs that I liked, because it was really easy for me to write about music that I loved. I loved writing about music. And suddenly that was a way out of the problem I was having, because I wasn't afraid of my computer on my desk. I was sitting down to write about something that I loved, and that there was no pressure on me. There was nobody looking over my shoulder to see what I was writing. I was just writing for the pleasure of it. And that helped with what I was doing. And eventually they ended up being anthologized, those little essays. So we all find ways and tricks and ways to get around it. But ultimately, whatever you do, you have to learn not to be afraid of your desk. And I always think when people are trying to write a first novel, it's really difficult because most of us have another job. You're doing something else at the time. And the temptation is to say, oh, I'm going to take 3 weeks off during the summer and write my great Russian novel. And you're not going to do that. Eventually the terror of that blank space is just going to overwhelm you. You learn to do a little bit every day, I think. For me, anyway, I'm really interested in the way Stuart writes. I would find that impossible to do, but that's part of the pleasure of writing in books, that there are so many different ways of writing. And in the end, the writers find a way to produce a book, and whatever works for you is your way of writing.
Well, that's kind of why I tweeted this quite often, and I stand by this, is that all writing advice is bollocks. Because it's
you should write poetry or cards, you missed a trick somewhere.
Because every writer's different. Every writer has a different experience, and you could ask 100 novelists what they do, what their method is, and you get 100 different answers. And oddly, you're when I did have that period a few years back, it was around 2014, 2015, where I was really struggling to write a novel. For having writer's block, I did an awful lot of writing. I was writing constantly, but just none of it was any use for anything. And it took a while to bring that back under control again. But one thing I'm reminded at the minute, because I've been reading The Dirty South, is although John and I share this sort of exploring this hinterland between sort of crime and horror, I think our writing styles couldn't be any more different. Whereas my writing tends to be quite terse. John, you very much luxuriate in the those kind of detours that you take through a character's background. And again, I tend to be very analytical as I read. And I'm noticing with John that a character will, if you're in their point of view, or even if you're not in their point of view, a character will appear, and you'll take the time to really explore that character, even if that detail isn't necessarily pushing the story forward in any way. You'll take time to just kind of delve in and kind of enjoy that and kind of luxuriate in the getting to know that character while you have them there. Which I'm kind of really conscious with in The Dirty South, and I'm really noticing that, and I'm enjoying it an awful lot. And it's a thing, it's the sort of thing where I'm now reading that thinking, I got to try that. I got to try doing some of that, But that leads me to the long-winded way to get to the question. Do you write short and add, or do you write long and cut?
When I began, I used to write quite short, relatively short and add. That my first draft would be maybe 60 or 70% of the length of a book. Now it tends to be close to 90%. What I used to do in the beginning was if I was struggling with a section of the book, I'd leave it. And I'd have to come back to it when I was doing my second draft. But then I realized I was leaving all the stuff that was difficult when it was making my second draft, because I was starting to dread the second draft as much as the first draft. And so now, even if it's a problematical thing, if it's something I'm really struggling with, I might end up just writing 500 words a day. My pace may slow, but I don't want to leave it as something to come back to. You see what you say. I mean, I think your writing is very lyrical. As you say, it is slightly terser than mine, but you can see that thought has been put into where every word goes. It's a different kind of poetry to what you do. But when you were talking about character, I've always been influenced by if you're going to be influenced by people who are so much better than you, and by Dickens, when I said that, I was just thinking, what an arse I sound. But then I was reminded of that lovely P.G. Wodehouse, which is my favorite line, I think, P.G. Wodehouse, where he says in his memoir, he says, Shakespeare's stuff is different from mine, which is not to say that it's inferior. And I just love that, yeah. So Dickens' stuff, it's a little bit different from mine, but it's not to say it's bad. He would have these characters who would come on for just a page or two, and they would be extraordinary. They would be these beautiful, finely drawn characters, and it was just a pleasure of seeing them drift through. And I remember reading Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead in school, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, for those who don't know it, it's a play by Tom Stoppard based around two characters who are briefly show up in Hamlet and then vanish and die off stage. They're essentially a pair of hired killers. We really never see what happens to them. And what Stoppard does is follow them. And I realized, it's something I should have realized long before that even, but it certainly has influenced my work, that actually, if you shift the focus of a novel, it becomes about a completely different character, because each of us is the center of our own universe. I'm pretending to be interested in everything Stuart has to say, but I'm still thinking, I still see Stuart as a planet vaguely orbiting the sun that is me, and we all live our lives to some degree like that. And so when these characters go on, I'm aware that perhaps in a kind of Venn diagram version of my books, they would occupy a different circle, and their lives would be the center and focus of these books. And so you start thinking in terms of that there are no such thing as minor characters. Everybody has a purpose and everybody has a place. Sorry, you're raising your hand, McKenna.
I'm going to raise my hand because we have a question that's completely relevant to this, but I haven't had a chance to get it in. So Ellie was wondering if your characters talk to you when you write.
No, I think that I feel that's a bit close now to wearing a tinfoil hat and things, and and talking to the mouse that lives there. I'm not sure that they do. No, I think for me anyway, and Stuart may have a different take on this. I think when you're writing a book, you live with it both when the idea is nascent, when it's still in your head, and when you sit down with it. When you're writing a book, you take the book everywhere with you. Even when you're not at your desk, it's there. And even when you don't appear to be thinking about it, you're thinking about it. And your unconscious is doing a lot of work on it. I think it's making connections that you're not even aware of. And so when you sit down to write, you can sometimes be amazed by what comes out. You can be astonished by the direction things take, and you think, my God, my characters, they have a life of their own. They could be living in my house. And it's actually not. I think it's the process that's going on in the background. And it's why, again, when you're trying to write, I think it's very important to give yourself time for that process to occur. So, you go for a walk, you distract yourself with cooking, you don't wear headphones in your ears all the time, because actually that interferes with what you're doing. You need to give space to that process. So a certain element of writing is done when you're away from your desk, when you're not thinking about it. And the analogy I've often used is like making a good stew or a gumbo, that you put all the ingredients in there and then you sit it to simmer on the stove and you leave it alone for a little while. You taste it occasionally, but you don't forever fiddle with it. You let the process occur. I know, Stuart, you may differ. You may feel your characters may live with you.
No, I think I do agree. I mean, it's what I have found happens fairly often. One specific example is with The Traveller, as in the titular novella here, when he was first appeared in Collusion, first book he appeared in my second book. I had planned him to be this kind of gentleman assassin, quite a refined sort of character. And the first line that I actually had in the book, I can't remember, it was dialogue maybe, he completely transformed this really vulgar, foul-mouthed thug with quite an extraordinary line of profanities. And I had no intention of being that until the moment I actually sat down to write. And sometimes you have to let the character onto the page first to figure out who they actually are. And I don't believe it's that my characters have a life of their own, that kind of thing. I think it is, as you said, this has been something that's always been bubbling under without me necessarily being conscious of it. And then when you actually sort of open the door and put that character on the page, all of a sudden they become something that you maybe hadn't been conscious of or intended. And the same thing has happened to me with major plot points on occasions. There's two specific ones. There's a big twist in Lost You, the second Hale and Beck book, that completely sort of turns everything on its head. It happens about 3/4 of the way through the book. And that's what I probably spoiled it for him who's going to read it. But I honestly had no intention of that huge twist happening until I was on the page where it happens. I had no idea this was going to happen myself. But again, I don't believe in any kind of very kind of the story writes itself kind of thing. I think it must have been lodged there somewhere in my head, but didn't reveal itself until the moment when I was actually writing it.
Yeah, I think it is that, for want of better, that mystery of the creative process, that, you know, there are odd things happening, and writers are, I'm certainly slightly reluctant to examine it too closely. It's like cutting the lark's throat to see how it sings, that the process is so delicate for most of us that we're just grateful when at the end of a year or two's work, a book is there. I always feel a slight sense of amazement that, you know, you've gone from what was just a nascent idea and you've worked your way through that period when you want to throw the thing away and think nothing is working here, and I'm going to have to go cleaning windows or get a proper job, or, you know, take guitar lessons from somebody with, you know, spare guitars or whatever it might be, so that I can find another way to earn a living. And so I'm sometimes it's why I've never really wanted to teach, because I'm almost worried about trying to pull apart that process that even I don't have a full understanding of. I'm just grateful that I've been able to do it, and that at the end of it I produce a book or a short story, and then when I sit down again, there isn't an idea for something else there, because I worry about that day when I won't have that idea. You know, for me, about halfway through the book I'm writing, a little germ of the idea for the next book will occur, and I'll set it aside, and there's almost a sense of relief that it's come back, and I worry that someday I'll get to the end of a book and there won't have been.
Do you ever have the problem?
You know, thankfully that hasn't happened.
Do you ever have the problem? I have this almost constantly, is the shiny thing that you're going to do next distracting you from the thing you're doing now. You said aside, I struggle to do that. I'm very often I have this sort of thing in my head, like, the book I'm writing now is rubbish. It's garbage. This is the worst thing anybody's ever written ever. The book I'm writing next, brilliant. That's going to be a huge bestseller. That's going to be fantastic. Martin Scorsese's going to adapt that for the screen. That's going to outsell everything in its calendar year. But that's the next book. The one I'm writing now is rubbish. So I sometimes very struggle to keep my mind on the thing I'm supposed to be doing as opposed to the thing I want to do, which is in the future.
Yeah, thought of it. It's the siren call of the new idea, and it's always going to be more appealing than the thing you're working on, because usually when it comes, you're in the weeds.
Yeah,
you know, you're stuck in that moment that we all have when we write a book, where we think, actually, this is where I've gone hopelessly wrong, and, you know, this is where I get found out. And I think that's why when I said earlier that decision, that commitment to finishing what I'm doing, that once I've written the first chapter or the first few lines, first few paragraphs, I've psychologically committed to writing the last ones, and I'm not going to get distracted, and I'm not going to set it aside for something else. I'm going to keep going with it, because actually we learn from the experience of writing. We've both written a lot of books now, that actually that the experience is pretty much the same for most of our books. Certainly for me, it doesn't vary very much. I go through that process of doubt. I go through that process of wanting to throw it away. I reach 60 or 70,000 words and it's really difficult. And then I get another spurt towards the end as I see the finish line in sight, and I actually know where I'm going by that stage. And I know that's part of the process. It doesn't make it easier every time it happens. You know, that doubt is still profound. That urge to throw it away is still profound. That urge to run after the new idea is still profound. But at least I know now that it's natural, that it comes along with the process, and I just have to learn to live with it. But I think I would, I'm worried if I started putting things aside, I think it would form a pattern for what was to come. And I think I would suddenly end up with a drawer filled with half-finished ideas, and that would be the end of my career, I think.
I have questions. So one,
yes,
I'm still here. I haven't pulled a Stuart and gotten up and walked out. All right. So we have a question for John from Sharon. What would Charlie Parker make of Jerry Fagan?
Jerry Fagan. Oh God. I think he'd quite like him. I think they're brothers under the skin a little bit. I think, you know, I think I'm not sure what he'd make of the Traveller. I think the Traveller is a really, you know, he's such a, When he first came onto the page, I thought there would be something almost admirable about him, and he's horrible, and in the novella in the book, there's a vileness to him he revealed unsuspected depths of vileness that I didn't think he really had. I thought he's almost irredeemable in this book. Whereas I think what's really interesting about Fagin is, and it's a common, but it's not a cliche, it's a convention, and it's a convention that I use as well. And I guess whether it's a cliche or a convention depends on how you use it. But Fagin is looking for redemption. Fagin is a man who's trying to atone, and I think we find that fascinating in books, whereas there's no sense of that in The Traveller. The Traveller's.
Have we lost him?
He just paused and then walked out.
Oh, he's back. He's back. He's back. He got redemption.
I think Charlie Parker would understand Jerry Fagin. I think as soon as they met, they'd be kind of, yep, I know who you are. I imagine that would be the reaction. Now, if you had Jack Reacher comes into the room, he'd probably just shoot the two of them on sight.
Okay, Stuart, we have a business question for you. Nikki was wondering, your agent found you through your short fiction. Was Ghost of Belfast finished when he contacted you?
It was actually, yeah. That we're going back to late 2007, I think, and I'd written The Ghost of Belfast in spring of 2007. I wrote it very quickly, like something like 10 weeks, and later in the year, then I had just kind of an itch that I wanted to see what Jerry Fagin was up to. And I wrote a short story called The Last Dance. And at that time, I was part of a kind of online critique group. And I posted the story there. And my friend, a really good writer called Chris Home, and suggested I submit it to Thuglit.com, was the online crime magazine, which I did. And I remember on my birthday, on January 25th, I got an email from Todd Robinson at Thuglit saying they were going to publish the story, which was fantastic. It was a nice birthday present. And I got a t-shirt for my trouble, which I still have. But it was published, I think, in February then. And about a few days after it went online, I got an email from a man called Nat Sobel, explaining that he happened to represent James Ellroy. He just happened to be my favorite author at that time. And could he read the novel that's mentioned in the bio? And a few days later, I had an agent. So it was a nice kind of sequence of events that I couldn't really plan, because oddly, I mean, The Ghost of Belfast, I didn't submit it very widely. And maybe, an awful lot of authors, when they're looking for agents, they'll submit to maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 agents before they try and find a match, if they find one at all. But for some reason, The Ghost of Belfast, because I wasn't quite sure what it was myself, was it a thriller, was it a horror story, whatever, I maybe only submitted to 3 or 4 agents in the UK, and got 4 rejections from all of them. Actually, one told me it was unpublishable. And then Nat Sobel came along and changed my life. That's what he said. But I do mean, as a general word to writers that are sort of trying to find their way over the transom at the minute, I know this I said all writing advice is possible. Here's some writing advice. When you're submitting to agents or editors, whatever it might be, and you get a rejection, you can't help but take it personally. It always stings, no matter if it comes with some kind words or not. You always feel like it's like a personal slap in the face. But it's so important to remember that every story has to connect with that particular agent or editor in a personal way, that they then feel that they can go and fight for it. And no matter how good your story is, no matter how good your writing is, not every editor or agent will get it. Not every agent or editor will find this fits with them, what they want to do. So that's really important to remember when you're submitting and you're trying to get that sort of first rung on the ladder, that when you get those rejections, and you will get rejected, that you can't take them personally. You have to understand that that particular story just wasn't right for that particular agent or editor. And it's really important to try and keep that in mind, because it's so easy to be discouraged and put off.
That is good advice. I think that it's applicable, not bollocks. So I always like to ask a question about reading, and we do have a question in the comments. So this is two-part on reading. My question is, what were some of the books that you read in your formative years that either were inspirations or made you think, I want to be a writer? And then the question from the comments is, what book have you read recently that just made you go, wow? John, let's start with you.
Blimey. I did an event at the Hay Festival some years back, and a kid asked me what was the first book I ever read, and I said it was an Enid Blyton book, who's probably more familiar to readers on this side of the Atlantic than on that side of the Atlantic, but with our children's author, big children's author, everybody read at some point an Enid Blyton book. And I used to read the Secret Seven novels, and the kid said, wow, so the first book you ever read was a mystery novel. And I'd never thought of it in those terms. I'd always just thought of her as a children's author. But I guess that read through an Enid Blyton novel when I was in junior school, and reading it phonetically with my finger under the words, because some of the words were a little bit bigger than I was used to. And for years, I've said this, there is a word in English, cupboard, your closet, essentially. And it's spelled C-U-P-B-O-A-R-D. But because I read phonetically, for me, it was cupboard. I'd never heard of this word used. So I think for years, my mother thought she was living with Freddie Bartholomew, you know, that, Mummy, the things from the cupboard, shall I get them for you? And so she was a big influence to me. And then people like, for me, James Lee Burke, Ross MacDonald, Dickens, and counting those people, and things that I've read lately that have blown me away. It's funny, at the moment, I tend to be reading a lot of older fiction. I just tend to be going back to material I should have read when I was younger. So I'm filling in gaps in my knowledge. But I did read, oddly, a piece of science fiction that a bookseller gave to me. I was been buying something else completely, and he said, oh, I think you like this book. And it was a book called How to Lose the Time War, it's called. And it's an extraordinarily lyrical, short little science fiction book about two female agents moving through time who fall in love through a series of messages they leave throughout history. And I just found it completely engrossing. And I would never have picked up that book in a million years had a bookseller not put it into my hands. And so it's one of the reasons why we're in lockdown in Ireland at the moment. You can't go into a bookstore. And it was one of the things I missed, was those little lovely moments when you went into a bookstore and a bookseller went, here, read this, or you saw the little handwritten note underneath the shelf that said, you know, somebody was enthusiastic enough about a book that they'd written a little short piece. So I had good fortune. So that's the book that I can think off the top of my head that really surprised me.
Your turn, Stuart.
It's interesting because the minute my kids are 7 and 9, it's been interesting.
I'm going to do a Stuart and let my dog out. I'll be back. Hold on.
Okay. It's been interesting seeing what they pick up on, the things that are interesting to them, because they've both become very avid readers. The older one, a little girl in particular, first, she was the one that really picked it up at first. And you all right, John?
Well, usually I go out with her, but I'm worried that you'll think that I'm being rude, and I kind of want to hear what you have to say. So I'm listening.
We're almost done. I'm sorry.
The dog, the dog needs to go.
But it's been interesting seeing what they picked up on and seeing the things that they're reading now that I read as a kid. Because my little boy, for example, just has been reading some Roald Dahl, loved Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and so on. And the things that they don't pick up on, when you say Enid Blyton, we've tried to get both our kids to read Enid Blyton, and it's not gone that well with them. I don't know if it's gone a little bit too old-fashioned maybe for them now. And then interesting, I remember one of the first series of books that I absolutely devoured and loving as a kid was the Willard Price adventure books. So the first one I think is Amazon Adventure. It's a whole series of books, and it's the Amazon Adventure, Congo Adventure, Arctic Adventure. And following these two brothers that go around the world collecting animals for their father's zoo. And there'll always be dastardly hunters trying to kill the animals and all this sort of stuff. And they're probably desperately old-fashioned and desperately maybe not showing the most enlightened attitudes because they're written in the 40s and 50s. But I loved those as a kid, and I bought a few of them for my kids to see will they pick them up as well. And I kind of doubt that they will, because tastes have changed that much. But then as a teenager, I grew up in the 80s, and if you grew up in the 80s, you read Stephen King. It just was the law at the time. So the first adult book I read was The Shining, which I read, I think, when I was about 13. And so that started a sort of a lifelong love of his writing, and also the short story collections. I remember Night Shift being one of the first collections of short stories that I really loved. And it wasn't until a fair bit later, until maybe my 20s, that it was that I moved on to crime. And I remember one of the first thrillers that I absolutely loved and discovered was, or I have a volume of both Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs in one book, which I read and reread again over many years, and Marathon Man by William Goldman as a sort of older throwback. But then discovering James Ellroy and Dennis Lehane, and I guess you'd call it kind of neo-noir school of writing, which became very influential on me. But then as I gone on, and I think one of the best writers working today is Megan Abbott, who I discovered after being a writer, and then her work actually made me think about my own writing, and reading it and thinking, I need to be better. I need to be a better writer. I can't write when somebody else can write like this. I have to try and get better at this. And I think every writer is a product of their reading, so that's why there is that kind of supernatural and crime element, because I can't sort of untangle the two. Which I guess neatly comes into the book I'd say that I really wiped me recently. It was a book called Sharp Teeth by Toby Barlow, which is set in LA, I think in the 90s possibly, but it's basically about a pack of werewolves who are actually wrapped up in organized crime as well, and about these rival packs of werewolves roaming around Los Angeles, basically killing each other and having these wars and so on. But it's written as noir, as a crime novel rather than a horror novel. It's also written in verse, which sounds like a terrible, terrible thing, but actually reads beautifully. The prose is absolutely gorgeous, and the characterization of these people, kind of their canine nature kind of overtaking them. And there's one character. No, I was going to say a spoiler there, but if you want to read a very different take on both a werewolf novel, a horror novel, and a crime novel all in one, I would say Sharp Teeth by Toby Barlow. I can
never get references to contemporary werewolves without thinking about What We Do in the Shadows and that lovely moment where vampires encounter Rhys Darby's group of werewolves, and one of the werewolves swears at the vampires, and Rhys Darby goes, "Now remember, werewolves, not swearwolves." And I just saw now I'm just stuck with that. But I'm really tempted. That book sounds really interesting.
It is very good. I can't recommend it.
All right. Is your dog okay, John?
She is. She's a bit damp and looking a bit resentful that I didn't go out with her, but she's certainly a lighter dog now, I think.
Mission accomplished. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I could sit here and listen to you two talk for the rest of the evening, but we can't do that. So I will repeat that I've put a link in the comments if you'd like to order copies of the books. We would love for you to order copies of the books. John's book is officially out on Tuesday. Stuart's is out now. If you order a copy of Dirty South, you get this Parker Investigations tote bag, as well as a signed postcard, and we have signed book plates on the way from Stuart. So the link is there. Thank you, gentlemen. This has been an absolute pleasure. My dog also is ready for this to be over. She's she's starting to get a little antsy, so I think it's time we wrap up. But I love talking with you as always, and I really appreciate your taking the time this afternoon.
Thanks for having us, Megan. Thanks,
Thank you.
Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye.